Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't actually going to speak today, but now that the gentleman from Rhode Island has spoken so vehemently about his point of view, I think I'll respond very briefly. I have the utmost respect for the gentleman and enjoy listening to him in this committee. But, you know, it's interesting. You're talking about how we've blocked all kinds of investigations and pursuing these terrible actions of the president over the last couple of years. But I think if you look at what's really happened, I mean, the president said there was no collusion. He said it over and over and over again. And many of us on this side of the aisle said, well, we should reserve our judgment until the Mueller report comes in. And I realize the entire thing hasn't come in yet, but we've pretty much got the basics of it. And that is that there was...
Will the gentleman yield to a question?
I will in a minute,
okay.
But there was no collusion. And I'm on foreign affairs, and I know Russia maybe has more relevance to that committee than the Judiciary Committee. I'm on both these, but I'm a long time, 23 years. But at this point, I think this Congress has a decision to make. In what direction do we go? How do we spend the next 2 years of our time in this committee? And I know that from what the gentleman is saying, he would suggest that perhaps we need to have ongoing investigation after investigation of what did this president do wrong and when did he do it wrong and who was involved and all that kind of stuff. And I haven't generally, I don't know if I've ever said it, but I haven't used the term witch hunt or hoax to my recollection. You know, I tend to try to be more thoughtful about these kinds of issues and let the facts ultimately play out. But I think to a considerable degree, to go on with investigation after investigation. I mean, perhaps there is one thing that we really ought to go into now and pursue, and that's the fact that in the last campaign, we really did have collusion, and that was the Democratic candidates' folks who essentially paid for this dossier and were colluding to some degree with the Russians and then influenced the FISA court to move ahead and to investigate their opposition in the campaign. So there really was something to be investigated there, I think. But if there was any collusion, that was it. But to spend our time for the next 2 years and go into all this investigation after investigation, perhaps what we ought to do is actually deal with some of the issues that we could work on in a bipartisan fashion. I've heard members on both sides talk about how the infrastructure really needs attention, that it's decaying, that our bridges and roads and tunnels and ports are falling apart, and they're right, they are. And we ought to be focusing on that, and that's something we could probably, in a bipartisan manner, come up with a solution that would really benefit the American people if we stop investigating this president and let him get on with his job. Maybe immigration. That'll be a little bit tougher because there are some real disagreements, but I think we all agree that we need to reform our broken immigration system. On our side, we tend to think that it's more security at our borders that needs to be dealt with. The other side, you know, will emphasize the separation of children, which I also think is wrong, although that policy was in effect under the Obama administration as well. But immigration is something maybe we could come to some agreement on. I think both sides agree that opioids specifically, but a lot of drugs are killing far too many citizens in our country. And there is some good news. My state, Ohio, had the largest decrease in drug deaths in recent months than any other state. So maybe we're turning the corner finally. I certainly hope so, because far too many of our fellow citizens have had their lives literally wiped out, the impact that has on those families. So those are just 3 issues. Off the top of my head, I could probably come up with a whole range of other issues. But I hope this committee, and I actually respect the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, as well. I've had an opportunity to work for him for many years. In fact, for 6 years, I was the chairman of the Constitution Subcommittee, and my ranking member was none other than Mr. Nadler, and we didn't agree on anything, but maybe the Voting Rights Act, we did agree. We had more than a dozen hearings on that with something like 50 witnesses, And so we did agree on some stuff, but we disagree on some things as well. But I have great respect for him. I hope he spends most of our time focusing on issues that we can actually make a difference that'll benefit the American people, not just a whole range of more investigations that'll end up dead ends like this one did. And I ran out of time, but if the gentleman from New York would give me an additional minute, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
I'll grant I'll recognize the gentleman for an additional minute.
Thank you. I'll yield to the gentleman.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I'm just trying to sort of understand, based on your comments, whether the gentleman supports the resolution, because this resolution, of course, continues the investigation of the president on a number of issues. I happen to think that it's worthwhile, which is why I support the resolution, but this is, of course, offered by your colleague, the ranking member from your own party. Do you support this action to...
I am not going to oppose it.
Okay, so if I can just then say, with respect to the Mueller report, you seem, in your comments, have suggested you're satisfied having gotten Mr. Barr's 4-page summary of it, but I hope you would agree that we don't actually know what the Mueller findings are.
I didn't say that I'm satisfied with it.
You said we sort of know its conclusions. We actually don't know them at all. We haven't seen the report.
Reclaiming my time. I think we all want to get the full report and read it. I want to do that too. But I think that Mr. Barr, when he came out and said no collusion, essentially, I know the president, relative to exoneration on obstruction of justice, and I was around during the Clinton impeachment too, and was one of the House managers, so I'm fairly familiar with how this stuff all plays out. And yes, we should read the whole report, and I want the whole report to come out to less such things as classified information or ongoing investigations, grand juries, and those types of things. My time's expired, so I yield back.